Okay, so I think we'll begin. I'm James Dennison. I'm a part-time professor at the Migration Policy Center. And this is an MPC webinar entitled Public Attitudes Towards Immigration and Immigrants. What are the factors affecting them and what can we do about it? And for this highly topical and I think intellectually stimulating webinar, which I'm sure it will be, we have three superb speakers who are ideally qualified to talk about this topic. So first we have Lenka Drazenova, who is a research associate at the Observatory of Public Attitudes to Migration at the MPC. She received her PhD in political science from the Berlin Graduate School of Social Sciences of Humboldt in Berlin. And she also holds additional degrees from Central European University and Charles University in the Czech Republic. She holds, her primary research agenda has two specific areas around the question of the current shift towards less tolerant populist and nationalist societies and politics in Europe, and if so, how can we explain the underlying causes? Jerome Gonettes is a postdoctoral research associate with the IPFLOS project at the Migration Policy Center. He works on the identification of the most influential factors driving public attitudes to immigration using meta-analytic multi-level modeling techniques as part of the IPFLOS project. And prior to joining the MPC, he obtained a PhD in economics from the Toulouse School of Economics. And finally, we have Karen Hargraves, who is an independent policy analyst and researcher focused on international refugee and migration policy. Her recent projects include work with ODI's Human Mobility Initiative, the IOM, and the IFRC, and her areas of interest include displacement, global policy approaches, and public attitudes towards refugees and migrants, as well as many others, which I'm not going to list now. So what I think we'll do in this webinar is each of the three speakers will have about 15 minutes to just overview their findings. And then after that, we'll open up the floor for Q&A. And I'm sure that there's going to be plenty of room for discussion and back and forth. So I think with that, we'll start with Lenka. And so you have the floor, Lenka, go ahead.
Thank you, James, for this kind introduction. So I will now share my screen. Hopefully everything will work just fine. Okay. So in my presentation today, I would like to talk about factors that affect attitudes to immigration. So probably not so much surprisingly, considering the theme of this webinar. I will start a little bit with a theoretical background, but very briefly because we have only a very short time for this presentation. So as you might have noticed, in recent years, attitudes to immigration became the new political cleavage. And in general, from sociology, we know that attitudes are divided into two groups. We have the so-called symbolic attitudes that have an affective basis and are more likely to be stable during lifetime. These are, for example, views about abortion, views about gun control, and so on and so forth. And on the other hand, we also have so-called material attitudes, which have a more cognitive and informational basis and are more likely to be responsive to changes over a person's life. So, for example, your preferences for tax policy might be changing, whether you are just entering the labor market, whether you are in the middle of the labor market, or whether you just retired. So these are more based on cognitive and information schemes, but we know that attitudes to immigration are highly symbolic. So they actually have a much more affective basis. What is also important to underline is that attitudes to immigration, we usually use this term quite loosely, but these attitudes can mean many things. So, for example, it can be a group of attitudes towards policy. So, for example, whether we prefer more or less immigrants in the country, whether we prefer that immigrants can enter the labor market immediately, or whether there is some time they cannot. It can also be opinions about immigrants, so whether we consider them good or bad, hardworking or lazy, and so on and so forth. It can be also an evaluation of a specific immigrant group. So for example, we might have very positive feelings towards immigrants from Norway, but think differently about immigrants from different parts of the world or with a different religion. And finally, we can also mean, by attitudes to immigration, we can also mean the perceived effects of immigration. So for example, whether immigration will have beneficial effects on the GDP per capita, whether it will be good or bad for the national culture, for the crime rates, and so on and so forth. So this is quite important to underline, that we often tend to talk about attitudes to immigration, but this is a very large group of attitudes, and they can mean different things, and also they might be influenced a little bit differently. So for example, attitudes towards policy are the ones that are more prone to listen to rational arguments, whereas evaluation of specific immigrant groups and so on are much more emotional and affective. So what actually affects attitudes to immigration? So there are many socializing agents of attitudes to immigration. What you see here is a figure that is actually taken from a co-authored paper with James here, and here you can think about this figure a little bit as a person goes through life. So on the left hand side, you have very strong and stable effects. So when you are born, you are forming your basic values, your personality type, and your moral foundations. And all these affect your attitudes to immigration. And these are very strong and stable effects. And as you go through life, then of course, you're also influenced by your parents, by the school you go to, by your community, whether you go to university or not, whether you lived abroad, and so on and so forth. And as we go on the right-hand side, these are effects that are much weaker and unstable. So for example, these are the political and media influence. So for example, if you vote for a specific party, whether this party has a very strong stance on immigration, you might be influenced by that, but not as much as, for example, you are influenced by your general approach or your general values. So in recent years, with the so-called migration crisis, there has been also an extensive literature regarding attitudes to immigration, especially in political science. And many different hypotheses have been proposed to explain differences in attitudes to immigration. And it has been a little bit difficult to align all of the evidence that the literature has produced so far. So with this regard, I actually proposed a systematization of the political science empirical research of public attitudes to immigration in the last decade. And this has been published as a working paper, as a small project, and I hope also it will be published soon as a journal article. And in a much larger project we are working on now, also together with Jerome, the Horizon 2020 IT Flows project. We are trying to systematize literature also not just from political science, but also from other fields such as sociology, psychology, and economics. But here today I will be presenting the results only from the political science part. So for those of you who are not familiar with meta-analysis, a meta-analysis is actually analysis of results from previous studies and a summary of the findings via quantitative methods. So basically, it is an analysis of analyses. The one meta-analysis can be conducted in several ways. The one I used here is a simplified combined test technique. And I looked at determinants of general attitudes towards immigration. So for example, as I have discussed at the beginning of this presentation, there are different attitudes. So I had to establish what attitudes I'm actually interested in. And I decided to go with the attitudes regarding the general effect of immigration on society. So these can mean, for example, attitudes regarding the effect of immigration on culture, economics, crime rates, and so on and so forth. I looked at published articles in 30 highly ranked peer-reviewed political science journals between the years 2009 and 2019. And here this flowchart shows the way I identify my sample. So as step one, I actually did a literature search looking through keywords such as immigration and immigrant in the selected journals databases. So this yielded 2,692 articles. Then, of course, I had to drop the non-relevant research, for example, qualitative research, review articles, or articles using other non-relevant dependent variables. Then I dropped also articles dealing with attitudes to immigration that were out of scope. And finally, this left me with a sample of 37 articles I looked at. In the simplified combined method, what you do is that you actually classify each independent variable into 3 categories. It can be either success, which means that the variable is significantly related to the dependent variable and the effect is in the hypothesized direction. It can also be failure, which means that the effect on the dependent variable is not significant. And finally, it can be anomaly, which is the effect, which means that the effect is statistically significant, but it is in the opposite direction than hypothesized. And after this, you calculate the so-called success rate, which is calculated by dividing the number of successes by the total number of times a variable has been tested in a model. And this gives an overview of a variable's influence on attitudes towards immigration. So what are the findings from this meta-analysis? So first of all, it is worth mentioning that an unprecedented number of variables has been investigated as affected attitudes to immigration. So there have been 115 independent variables included in the models throughout all the studies, and only age and gender were included in more than half of the studies. So from what this means is that each single article introduces plenty of new independent variables in their models, but very few variables are consistently tested, whether they have an effect on attitudes to immigration or not. And actually, most of the times, these variables are included without any motivation or or hypothesis, or without a hypothesis regarding their effects. Moreover, many factors are often considered as additive explanations of attitudes to immigration, and conditionality is rarely studied. So, for example, on the other hand, we know that effects of many factors, such as minority share in neighborhoods or education, on immigration attitudes are conditional upon other factors, but this is rarely tested in the literature. And I will be talking about this a little bit in a few minutes. So what are the factors most often hypothesized to influence attitudes to immigration? So as I mentioned previously, it is education. Is it actually influential? Yes, but it is context dependent, and I will be talking about this in a few minutes, a little bit more. The same goes for age. So it is true that all the respondents are more anti-immigration, but much less than expected. So the success rate is only 60%. What does this mean is that only 60% of the time that age is included in the model, it is significant and in the expected direction, and 40% it has no effect whatsoever. Gender is kind of sort of a black box, I would say. So the hypothesis has been that men are more anti-immigration than women, and this is based especially on the literature regarding voting for radical right parties, where we know that the voters for the radical right parties are mostly men. But for example, in attitudes to immigration, it seems that there is either no difference between the two genders, or women are a little bit more anti-immigration, actually. And what might be a little bit surprising is that actually income, for example, is not very significant. It has only 16% success rate. So it seems that this does not influence much differences in individual attitudes to immigration. So I would like to talk very little because we don't have much time about age and education, which are the variables very often put in the models, but it is not as simple as it might seem. So we tend to expect all the respondents to be more anti-immigration than younger respondents, but the big question is why. So because age is not such a simple variable. What does it mean? Age, of course, can have a biological meaning. So it is a physiologic process that changes with age. And so why would we expect older people to be more anti-immigration? The argument here would be that as people age, their cognitive ability is lower, and the way they make judgments and evaluate society changes. And this is the reason why we see differences between old and young. On the other hand, age can mean a life cycle transition. So what does this mean is that you occupy different positions in the social structure, you change roles and relationship as you age. So here the argument would be that people's attitudes change as their interests and perceived benefits fluctuate over the life course. And finally, what age can also mean is cohort membership. So people born at a particular time and space encounter the same set of historical, culture, and political circumstances. And the reason why we actually see differences between the old and young would then mean that the shared experiences during formative years shape values and attitudes of these cohorts, and then these persist over their life course. So recent evidence in the political science literature confirms that the reason for the differences between the old and young are actually cohort effects. So when we isolate the effect of birth cohorts, a person's biological age is no longer significant. And also the most recent evidence of cohorts effects across Europe shows that cohorts socialized during landmark immigration events, or cohorts socialized when there was a strong far-right anti-immigration presence, or cohorts that entered the labor market when the unemployment rate was high, are much more likely to have more negative attitudes towards immigration even later in life. And so as we have seen, it is not so simple with age, and the same goes for education. So it doesn't sound very surprising when I claim that individuals with higher levels of education are generally more positive towards immigration. But on the other hand, here again, it's not as simple because, for example, it has been shown that education is indeed positively associated with liberal attitudes in the US and Western Europe, but much less in other parts of the world. And for example, in my book published a few years ago, I showed that there are certain conditions that must be fulfilled, such as the length of democracy or a certain level of GDP per capita, for education to have any effect on attitudes to immigration or tolerant attitudes. So in countries that do not fulfill this criteria, there is really no difference between those with a university degree and those with only elementary education. So I have now a little bit deconstructed that it's not so simple, neither with age, neither with education. So actually, what are the factors that are highly successful in explaining attitudes to immigration? So at the individual level, it appears that it is, for example, the general left-right positioning of a person. So more rightist position leads to more anti-immigration attitudes. What seems to be highly influential is also whether the respondent resides in a city or in a rural area with less urban residency means more anti-immigration attitudes, and also whether a respondent has a minority friend or has contact with minority. And those with no friends or contact with minority are generally more anti-immigration. On the other hand, at the country level, it is very important what is the share of the immigrant or foreign-born population in the country. Countries with lower share are more anti-immigration. Also, what seems to have quite a big influence is a country's GDP per capita. Lower GDP leads to more anti-immigration attitudes, as does higher unemployment. So to conclude this presentation, what came out of the meta-analysis I presented today is that only a handful of independent variables are systematically included in studies addressing attitudes to immigration. On the other hand, I have to admit the meta-analytical method I used for this working paper is not the most complex. These may call upon directly comparable test statistics, the so-called meta-estimates, which is exactly what we are doing now in this Horizon 2020 IT Flows project. So hopefully soon we will be able to provide a much more comparable test statistics. What is also worth mentioning is that a lot of scholarly attention is pointed at explaining the individual level factors affecting attitudes to immigration and much less cross-national and cross-regional differences. But I believe this is quite a lot of important also, for example, for the future of the EU, where we have seen in recent years there has been quite a sharp divide between the new EU members and the old EU members, also in, for example, refugee quotas and so on and so forth. So it might be worth digging into why certain countries are much less pro-immigration than others. Another critical question for future research might be how do the relationship between attitudes of immigration and their explanatory factors hold in different contexts. So what we observe in the last decade in the political science literature is that most of the papers deal with the United States or Western Europe, and much less attention is actually dedicated to countries that are not from the West. But this might lead to certain problems with the sample, and there is this overt emphasis on the Western countries might not provide us with some causal explanations actually. So thank you very much. This is all from me, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Lenka. That was such a very thought-provoking presentation, also exhaustive in your approach, but systematic, which I think is something that we really need right now with all these findings out there. I also particularly like the finding that older people are more anti-immigration because of cognitive decline. That's nice to see you not shying away from controversy there. Okay, so next we have Jerome Gonettes, and you feel free to take the floor, Jerome.
Thank you, James, and thank you all for joining today. Let me share my screen first. Can you see the slide? Is everything working? Yeah, I think it works. All right. Yeah, so thank you, Lenka, for this presentation, which actually helps me transition to what I'm going to talk about today, and in particular the role of economic factors in driving public attitudes to immigration. Before I start with the actual evidence, I'd like to give you a bit of theoretical background and some precision as to the sort of literature that I'm going to review today and where the evidence comes from. Lenka rightly said that symbolic attitudes matter a lot when it comes to public opinion to immigration. In this presentation, of course, I'll be looking at material attitudes, what Lenka coined as material attitudes, and in particular the role that education and income play to drive these attitudes. So in economics, and again, I want to stress that this is going to be a presentation that is that focuses on evidence from the economics literature. We have the theoretical framework to address the public opinion about immigration, and this theoretical framework has two main pillars. So two main economic channels that are usually hypothesized and tested. The first one is the labor market channel, and the labor market channel goes as follows. The individual should fear the competition for jobs and the pressure on wages from migrants that have the same skills as they do. This is the first channel that we are going to be looking at, and the second one is the welfare channel. So obviously, the issue of public finance has become a very, very hot topic and politically debated topic in recent years. And when it comes to attitudes to immigration, the way economists look at its effects on public opinions to immigration is that it is an income-based effect. So not based or depending on individual education, but rather income, where two scenarios are possible. The first one would be that essentially the arrival of poor migrants or relatively poorer immigrants than the native population would provoke a fiscal leakage, which means that the benefits, the welfare benefits that natives are entitled to would go down, or the amount of those benefits will go down because migrants contribute less to public finances. The second scenario is a scenario in which these benefits are sustained and remain unchanged, but in order to be financed, this requires a tax rate increase, which will be mostly supported by, well, it's not supported, but the cost of which will be borne by rich taxpayers. Those are the two main theories and economic channels that I'm going to talk about today. And finally, I have a short slide on the distinction between cultural values and economic factors. Why is that? Because as you're probably well aware of, there's a high correlation between individual educational attainment and income level and cultural racism. And it's not always easy to disentangle the role played by each of these mechanisms. Now, what kind of evidence am I going to discuss today? Obviously, this is a presentation based on the evidence from the economics literature. So what Lenka discussed in her presentation will not be included here, but I will have something to say about the distinction between the evidence from the political science and the economics literature later on. The findings cover the past 20 years, I would say, and between 1990 and 2010, focusing on upper middle and high income countries, mostly the OECD area, and Eastern Europe. The reason for that is simply because the studies that we have in economics focus on these regions, these particular regions. And importantly, Lenka rightly pointed out that there are different sorts of attitudes, and the econ literature actually focuses on attitudes to immigration policy. So not individual assessment of the consequences of immigration, but rather attitudes to immigration levels. And this is, again, something that I will be obviously focusing on today. There's less known, especially by economists, about the impact of beliefs about the economic consequences of immigration and how these beliefs might drive individual attitudes, but I will have something to say about this as well. Now let's move on to a first channel, so labor market competition. But the principle here, the economic principle, which is very, very simple, is that of skill complementarity. And what the econ literature has found is that overall, meaning in the US and Western Europe, mostly, natives are usually more positive towards immigrants that have skills that are complementary to their own. So it's a very simplified framework, if you will, where you have high skill on the one hand and low skill on the other hand. And complementarity is simply means that the opposite level of skill. So in the US, for instance, there's ample evidence actually, that less skilled workers are significantly more likely to prefer limiting immigrant inflows. And when we look at cross-country studies here, you see that this effect actually depends on the relative skill level of immigrants. Now, what does this mean? It means simply that the individual native skill level is positively correlated with pro-immigration preferences if natives are relatively more skilled than immigrants on average. So always this idea of complementarity. I shall add that actually, even if on aggregate, highly educated people are generally more positive towards immigration, this skill complementarity argument channel, if you will, is also plays out among highly educated individuals, and there is a recent study on workers in the high-tech sector in the US that shows just this, which is precisely that these native workers in the US working in the high-tech sector are very much opposed to extending visas to our high-tech workers from India, for instance. At the same time, this complementarity effect among high-skilled workers must be nuanced, as there is some evidence that for very specific occupational sectors, the high level of human capital can sometimes act as a shield against the labor market threat from immigration, meaning that even if immigrants are highly skilled, people who work in very specific sectors where they, with intense or high level of human capital, can sometimes be immune from this skill complementarity effect and the threat from immigration, because the job that they occupy is so specific and requires such specific skills that they actually tend to nuance and moderate the threat from competition for jobs with immigrants. Now, moving on to welfare threats, so our second mechanism, the evidence at our disposal suggests that natives react in a way that is consistent with the tax adjustment scenario. So you remember there were two possibilities, and the tax adjustment scenario with one in which benefits remain at the same level, even with the arrival of a massive arrival of immigrants, but in order to sustain the welfare system, the tax rate has to increase, or at least to adjust, in order to make that possible. So for instance, in the US, there's evidence that rich taxpayers living in areas and states with high fiscal exposure to immigration, so simply meaning that this fiscal exposure concept is simply the idea that they live in places where the share of immigrant households receiving public assistance is comparatively higher than the share of native households receiving this assistance. And those rich taxpayers are more opposed to immigration. And this evidence is obviously suggestive that they fear in some way the fiscal effect of these low-skilled immigrants. Now moving to cross-country evidence, there is heterogeneity, again in line with this tax adjustment scenario. Why is that? Because you see that high-income individuals will oppose immigration where migrants are relatively unskilled and as such a net burden to the welfare states. And obviously the country holds as well. I'll give you an example. There's a study from about 10 years ago looking at individual attitudes to immigration in the 2000s. And what the authors of this study found is that increasing real income, so again, income here, not education level, which is essentially controlled for, but here really speaking of income, when you increase real income, you decrease the probability that in the individual respondent will be pro-immigration in the US, where on average immigration is relatively unskilled, or at least perceived as being relatively unskilled. And while increasing real income will decrease the probability of being pro-immigration in a country like Slovak Republic, where immigration is perceived as being relatively more skilled than the native population. So these evidence are actually in line with the idea that the welfare threat goes through the tax adjustment mechanism that I've described before. Importantly, you see here that individual skill and income have opposite effects on individual attitudes. So the skill level of immigration implies, for instance, that high-skilled natives will prefer low-skill immigration for labor complementarity reasons, but resent it because of the threats that they pose from a welfare perspective and the fiscal burden that they could represent for public finance. So what the literature finds in terms of the respective weight of these two channels, labor market and welfare, is that they tend to offset each other. And there's this mixed evidence as to which one is really more important in terms of variance and attitudes explained. Studies, cross-country study that I mentioned before, for instance, found that labor market determinants are marginally more important than welfare state variables. But you have other studies, country-specific, in the UK, for instance, that has there's one in particular that found that actually welfare concerns are more important in the determination of attitudes than labor market concerns. So on this issue, that there is no actually definitive answer. Now, I said before that I would focus on the evidence from the econ literature, and I will. I just want to stress that this is a gap in the econ literature. The fact that beliefs about immigration, individual beliefs about immigration, and in particular the impact that they have on the economic welfare, whether at the individual level or at the country level or aggregate level, and the role that these beliefs may play in driving public opinion to immigration is absent from the econ literature. So here I'm going to refer to a recent political science study conducted in the US, which was actually looking at the link between personal economic concerns and attitudes to immigration, and in particular attitudes to immigration policy. And I will read out the quote that I put here, but what this very interesting study found is that the reason why Americans have different policy preferences about admitting highly versus low-skilled immigrants is that they have distinct beliefs about how these different types of immigrants will affect their households and the economy of the country as a whole. So what does this mean? The first thing is that this apparently is perhaps not in line, but at least corroborates the theory that the econ literature has about the mechanisms through which economic factors influence public opinion to immigration. But more importantly, or I'd say the major takeaway from the study by Gerber et al. Is that the beliefs about immigration are different based on individual skill and income level. So first, low-skilled respondents perceive more labor market threats than highly skilled respondents from immigration, and these labor market worries are a greater source of opposition to immigration for low-skilled natives than for highly skilled citizens. So the relationship, it tells us a little bit about the relationship between beliefs about immigration and attitudes to immigration, obviously attitudes understood as attitudes to immigration policy level. And second interesting finding from this study is that highly skilled respondents, again in the US, the way they react to immigration is strongly predicted by their belief about the fiscal burden that new immigrants might impose. So here, again, I want to stress that in this study, individual respondents were asked specific questions about their assessment and their evaluation of immigration on a set of economic consequences and variables such as the fiscal impact, the labor market impact, etc. Now, before I conclude, I would like to say a few things about the distinction that is often very hard to make between cultural racism, ideology, if you will, and the role of economic factors as I just described them in this presentation. To the best of my knowledge, this is something that has not been very much studied, scrutinized by the econ literature. But there's a recent recent paper published last year about just this by Tobias Müller and his co-authors. And in this paper, they use a new methodology to decompose the attitudes to immigration in a way that allows them to isolate the role played by economic factors from the fact that more educated individuals are in general more tolerant towards other cultures and towards immigration. And I'm not going to get obviously to the technical details of their work, but I will give you their main conclusions. And firstly, their findings corroborate previous studies and results that the ones actually I just described about how important the skill composition of migrants is to driving public opinion to immigration, and also the fact that the labor market and welfare state channels tend to offset each other and compensate each other to the point that it's very hard to say which one actually outweighs the other. And more importantly, here, what they find in this study is that economic mechanisms are significant determinants of attitudes, but that non-economic factors play a more decisive role, which means simply that they're more important in explaining the link that is often found in the literature, whether economics or where it's political sciences or other fields of study, the link between individual level of education and attitudes to immigration. So non-economic factors matter more. To wrap up, I'd like to give you a couple of takeaway points from this presentation. The first one is that economic factors influence individual attitudes through two different mechanisms. The first one being the labor market channel, and the second one, the welfare state channel. That these channels tend to offset each other. So based on the skill composition of immigrants, they go in opposite directions. And importantly, that the skill composition of migrants influences public opinion, which is a very, very important thing to bear in mind. Now, that said, the criticisms that are often made to the econ literature or the econ methodology is that we, or economists, I'd say, do not distinguish specifically in the survey data that they use between the type of migration. So they tend to test their theory using the principle of reveal preferences, but they rarely use data that distinguishes in the questions that people are asked between highly skilled and low skilled immigrants. Likewise, the lack of precision in the data is, or at least the data that is used, such that it's very hard to say something about the role played by beliefs about the economic impact of migration in driving these attitudes. I think the literature itself is making some progress towards actually addressing these concerns. And what I think is perhaps the main message here is also what was found in this recent study, that basically the link between education and individual attitudes to immigration owes more to non-economic factor than it does to economic factors. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jerome, for such a thorough presentation, also very thought-provoking. I've got a few questions, but I'll wait for the final presentation first, which is by Karen Hargrave. So when you're ready, Karen, go ahead and take the floor.
Great, thanks, James, and thanks to colleagues at the Migration Policy Centre for inviting me to speak today. Really delighted to join the discussion. I'm just going to pull up my slides. There we go. Right, so today I'm going to be sharing findings from a recent report that I published last year with ODI, looking at public attitudes towards immigration and immigrants, with my wonderful co-authors Helen Dempster and Amy Leach. But before I get into the findings from the paper, I just wanted to say a few words about how the paper came about. So my own background is as a researcher, a practitioner, sometimes an advocate, working in the broader field of migration and refugee policy. And I think, as has been really well demonstrated today, there's a huge amount of really excellent research and analysis out there looking at attitudes towards immigration and immigrants in a wide range of contexts. And my own interest in this is really from the perspective of the practical implications of this. So looking at, once we know about what attitudes are in any one context and what's shaping attitudes, what does this mean for people who are working on migration and refugee policy and practice on a day-to-day basis? And it's this sort of angle of the practical implications of public opinion research that I'm going to focus on in my presentation today. So the research I'm presenting is essentially an update of an older piece of work, also with Helen Dempster, that we published with ODI in 2017. And the rationale behind the original work was that there was this huge evidence base out there globally on attitudes towards immigration, but there was much less that was sort of bringing it all together. So there was a lot of great, very detailed work looking at attitudes in specific countries, for example, in the UK. There's a lot of work that was sort of looking at bringing this together across European countries, for instance, or bringing together, as Lenka did brilliantly earlier, the evidence on the different drivers of attitudes. But where we saw this gap was in terms of bringing together the global evidence on what people think about immigration, why, and then looking practically about what that means for policy and for practice. So that's what we tried to do with our original paper in 2017. And by last year, this really felt well overdue an update, not least because in the last year, we've really seen a proliferation of surveys and research looking at public attitudes towards immigration. And also, I think, of interest in this as an area of research. So as I mentioned, I'll focus on recommendations for our paper in particular, but I did briefly want to touch on what we know from global survey data. So the first few slides will be very familiar to those who already work on immigration attitudes. So if that's you, perhaps this is the moment to take 2 minutes and grab a cup of tea. But I did want to include this for the benefit of those who are coming at this from a wider background. So first, just a few words about the types of data that we have out there on immigration attitudes. So there's several global surveys that include questions on immigration, the Gallup World Poll, World Values Survey, for example. We also see several regional surveys, particularly focused on Europe, so the ESS, for example, in Europe, but also in other world regions, so surveys such as the Afrobarometer, Arab Barometer, Asian Barometer, that include 1 or 2 questions that are relevant to immigration. And then we also have national surveys that go into attitudes in more detail at the national level. So particularly we see those in countries like the UK, the US, European countries, Australia. So they're particularly concentrated there in sort of Western or high income countries. And in general, the evidence that we see on attitudes in low and middle income countries tends to be far patchier and far less detailed. And of course, the methodologies and the questions that are asked vary between these surveys, but they tend to fall into 4 key areas. So first, measuring respondents' immigration policy preferences. So asking questions like, would you like to see more or less immigration into your country? Secondly, looking at perspectives on the impacts of immigration, so asking respondents if they see overall positive or negative impacts, or asking specifically about economic or social and cultural impacts. Thirdly, sort of questions that look at measuring acceptance, so questions like, would you be happy to live next door to immigrants as your neighbours? And then fourthly, a sort of sets of questions that are measuring the salience of immigration as an issue. And I think that's a sort of set of questions that can sometimes get a little bit less attention, or it's a little bit less prominent in the research, but essentially looking at how important immigration is considered compared to other issues like the economy, jobs, public health, and sort of so on and so forth. So this evidence base is large, it's varied, and it tells us a lot. So in our paper, we tried to look across this evidence base just to pull out just a few key trends from the data. I think there's plenty others that you could point to, but just a few that we pulled out in the paper. So firstly, the finding that globally, surveys tend to suggest that few want more immigration. So if we look at recent polling data, global averages tend to show the vast majority of people either preferring to keep levels of immigrants in their country at the current levels or to reduce them. But if that paints a little bit of a negative picture in terms of attitudes, I think it's also important to understand the limits of global or even regional or country averages. So survey data shows huge variations in attitudes between regions, countries, even subnationally. Another key finding we pulled out in the paper from the global evidence is this really mixed picture from the data on whether immigrants are seen to enrich economies, and seeing sort of big variations there between countries, between surveys. And I think that's something that our previous presenters really sort of spoke to, the kind of overwhelming amount of evidence we have on this, and the sort of mixed picture that we can get from it. And sort of also coming out from the global evidence, quite prominent concerns, particularly in European countries, around pressures on public services that Jerome touched on in his presentation. We also see some interesting trends in terms of which immigrants are preferred. So we tend to see greater opposition to immigrants who are from different ethnic and cultural backgrounds to respondents. And that comes out particularly in surveys in Europe, but we also see interesting findings on this from elsewhere. So there's a very interesting Arab Barometer survey looking at attitudes in Casablanca towards sub-Saharan African migrants. So we do see some similar finding elsewhere. And we also see that attitudes tend to be more positive when people are asked specifically about refugees as opposed to immigrants. I think there's some complexities there. So we do see suspicion in some contexts around whether people are sort of quote unquote genuine refugees. So there are definitely complexities and nuances to the evidence. But overall, when people are asked about refugees specifically, survey data tends to suggest that people appear more positive. So in the paper, we also go into quite a bit of detail on what's known about the drivers of attitudes. I think the previous presenters have really covered that a lot of ground there in terms of drivers. So I'm not going to go into that in a huge amount of detail, but I did want to emphasize just one key takeaway in that respect. And that's really the central role that we see from emerging research in terms of an individual's values and worldview in terms of attitude formation. I think that came out in Lenka's presentation. So we see that attitudes are influenced to varying extents by an individual's personal experiences as well as the wider world around them. But what comes out quite strikingly looking at the evidence is how all of these more contextual factors and how individuals interpret their experiences and the world around them appear to be mediated by their underlying values and overall worldview. I think that's important, not just in terms of the kinds of messages that are likely to resonate around immigration, but also this understanding is quite closely linked to an emerging way of analysing immigration attitudes called attitudinal segmentation, which I think is particularly interesting in terms of digging beneath some of the more top-line trends from the global data. So in a nutshell, attitudinal segmentation divides the public into different segments based not only on their attitudes towards immigration, but also their broader values and attitudes towards related issues. So for example, multiculturalism, diversity, or social change, and typically doing that through mixed methods research. And that's primarily been done so far in European countries, and More in Common as an organization have been particularly key in driving that forwards. And you can see on the slide the results from attitudinal segmentation carried out in 6 countries. And generally what we see across these contexts is sort of up to a third of people falling into the most hostile groups towards immigration, and up to a third falling into some of the groups that are most open. But then the largest segment of the public falling into what has been called a conflicted or an anxious middle. So one that's often less ideological, tends to be more ambivalent towards immigration, and essentially being more open to persuasion. So those are just that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour through some of the key takeaways from our overview of the global evidence base. But what I wanted to focus on now is thinking about, practically speaking, what does all of this mean for future action? So we have quite a few recommendations in the paper that are particularly targeted towards those who want to engage with and influence immigration attitudes. And I'm going to focus on 3 of those in particular today. The first recommendation that I'll speak to is really in terms of the evidence base that we have on immigration attitudes. So as I mentioned, there's a huge amount of evidence out there. I think there's a huge amount that can be done already with this, practically speaking. But we also found that there are some key gaps to look at if we're thinking about building a strategic global evidence base that can be a foundation for policies, practice, and advocacy grounded in public opinion. And the first gap that we've identified in terms of the data and analysis of attitudes in low and middle income countries. And this is something I know Lenka also spoke to, and it's something that I focused a lot on in other work recently with ODI and with others, looking at attitudes in sub-Saharan Africa in particular. And it's really a constant frustration of mine that while most of the world's refugees and many of the world's migrants live in low and middle income countries, at the moment that's where we know the least about attitudes. I think there's a huge amount that could be gained in terms of policies and practices in low and middle income countries, as well as aid investments, if we understood the attitudes there in the very detailed way that we do, for example, in Europe and North America. The second gap that we highlight is in terms of the questions that are used in surveys. So as I spoke to earlier, these questions tend to often focus around questions like whether people want more or less immigration into their country, which I think is, can be very interesting as a top-line statistic, certainly can be interesting in a political sense. But and can also be much less useful in terms of forming actual immigration policies. So something we highlight in the paper for immigration policy making, also for advocacy around immigration policy, is that one of the most useful questions to ask really is what kind of immigrants the public do want and why. And I think that's where we can start to identify openings for shifts and policy reforms. And that's something that, it's not that these kind of questions aren't being asked at all, they are, but it's something that we tend to see more in some of the more detailed country level surveys, but tends to be less common in some of the global and even some of the regional surveys. And the third point is, as I spoke to earlier, in the paper, we also highlight the value of attitudinal segmentation in terms of really getting beneath the surface of public attitudes in different countries and providing very practical insights. So I think it would really be helpful to see more of this in more countries worldwide as an approach that really warrants further investment. The second recommendation I wanted to speak to is in terms of coordination between different actors around this evidence and looking at how this kind of research and its implications is communicated to the people who use it, from policymakers to actors who are trying to engage with or even influence public opinion. And then looking at building collaboration and dialogue between these groups in terms of the kind of data that's needed. And then once we have the data, what the implications are for specific countries, regions, or even globally. And I hesitated to include this recommendation today because I think it can feel a little bit abstract. So I wanted to give just one very concrete example of what this could look like. It's an example that I use quite a lot, I think, in the hope that someone will pick it up and also find it interesting. But I mentioned earlier the gaps that we see in terms of evidence in low and middle income countries on public attitudes. So one idea is, why not take the top 5 refugee hosting countries in the world and build dialogue between the host governments there, humanitarian organizations working there, donors who fund work in those countries, public opinion experts and pollsters, and then discuss how do we start working together towards building the kind of evidence base on attitudes to refugees, just in those 5 countries that we have in Europe, for example, and take that as a starting point. So that's just one example, but in the paper we talk through wider types of collaboration in more detail, in terms of collaboration between different types of actors, between different disciplines, and also thematic areas, recognizing that immigration is really linked in public perceptions to wider issues, for example, jobs or public services. So seeing the need to collaborate across those thematic areas as well. And the final recommendation I'll speak to today is really specifically targeted towards those who are hoping to engage with or even shift the dial on public attitudes towards immigration. So as I spoke to earlier, existing research, I think, makes clear that there's a lot that emerging evidence is sort of pointing towards the fact that attitudes are really at their most fundamental level influenced by an individual's values and worldview. And in the paper, we point to several examples of very good and very nuanced civil society campaigns and advocacy. But I think we can also look to examples where there is sort of less good practice and where too often we've seen a tendency for campaigns to sort of start from the point of wishing that individuals simply had different values or that they saw the world, for example, in the way that migration advocates do. So the recommendation there is really that those seeking to engage with attitudes towards immigration instead start from the understanding that these core values are relatively fixed, and then focus on really understanding them and how they vary with different individuals and different parts of the public, and look at what can be done within their parameters. And looking at how this is perhaps most likely to be successful by focusing on messages that are likely to resonate with so-called anxious middle groups. So those who are likely to hold concerns about the impacts of immigration, but which can in theory be addressed by nuanced arguments that are framed and really engage and speak to their values. And the final point here is really the opportunity to think about this in terms of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and recovery. So looking at how COVID-19 presents an opportunity to move the conversation on from talking about immigrants and immigration per se, to focusing on skills and the roles that immigrants play in our economies and societies. And colleagues at ODI's Human Mobility Initiative have done some brilliant work around this, and you can see one of their beautiful visualizations on the slide here. So really looking at how the COVID pandemic has made migrants' contributions particularly visible as key workers in our societies. So from scientists and doctors, but also sectors where workers are traditionally considered lower skilled, so sectors such as agriculture, and seeing a real opening here as conversations perhaps start tentatively turning towards recovery from the pandemic, if and when we hit that point, for those who are advocating immigration policy reforms, start situating immigration within this broader conversation in a way that speaks to the values of middle segments of opinion. So talking not just about immigration, but the skills that our economies and societies need and the role that immigration can play within that. So I think I am going to leave it there. But a big thank you once again to colleagues from the MPC for the opportunity to share the findings from the paper. And yeah, really looking forward to the discussion and to your questions.
Thank you very much, Karen, for the fascinating overview of the recent report and also the very, I think, timely and important recommendations. So in the chat box on YouTube, we already have a few questions that have come in. So I think we'll start with that. And then I also have some of my own questions, but maybe we'll focus on those from YouTube first. So the first question is for Lenka from Ettore Recchi, and he wonders whether there might be a further step up the ladder of abstraction and speak about belief formation in terms of rational action theory versus socialization. So I think there he's referring to the funnel, and maybe there's like a step further back, although I don't want to put words in his mouth. So I don't know if you want to go ahead and answer that, Lenka.
Yes, so thank you very much for this question. So unfortunately, this presentation was only 15 minutes, so I could not go much further. But this is actually something I do in my research. I focus on basically trying to provide scientifically some evidence that what I believe regarding attitudes to immigration, that is much more about the socialization than the actual let's say rational action theory. So there has been quite not only my own but other research and quite a few years of research showing that individuals are socialized quite early in life, and we don't know exactly when this period ends, but there is some period of plasticity that is usually not after 25 years old. I mean, there is some social scientists don't agree that much, whether it's 18 or 25, but it's around the time. And after this period, it seems that people rarely change attitudes. So for example, what you thought when you were 30 years old, you are probably going to think when you are 60. I mean, of course, exceptions exist, whether, for example, based on some trauma or things like that. So for example, when you had a firm belief regarding not just attitudes to immigration, but regarding, for instance, gun control, but then you actually live yourself some problem, let's say in the US and so on, you might change your opinion. But otherwise, these opinions rarely change. And there has been a very recent research published in March, I believe, which looked at 50 different types of attitudes. So not just attitudes to immigration. And basically, it shows exactly this, that people, although provided with different information, or although living through different time periods, very rarely change their opinions. So it seems to point to socialization rather than any type of rational action theory. And I try to show this with regard to age and education in my own research. And I could talk about this quite a lot, but unfortunately we don't have that much time. So my point would be that definitely I do not believe in the working paper I presented here today, but in general, in future research, this is the direction to go towards.
Okay, thank you, Lenka. The questions are coming thick and fast for Karen on YouTube right now. So I think before we get to that, I'm just going to ask Jerome a question, which on his more economic focused presentation. so Jerome, you spoke about these two different types of economic factors, I suppose, which is to do with the labor market and also concerns about the welfare state. And I just wonder, is that, so I think that's very interesting, compelling, and I also think it's good to be nuanced. But I just wonder, is it a bit over-optimistic about the capacity of people to hold nuanced attitudes, and perhaps a little optimistic, I mean, admittedly it's from the economics literature, but how direct sort of real world economic stuff affects different attitudes in different ways, and they're quite separate, and then they have these different competing effects? I mean, maybe it could just be that people's attitudes to these different things are fairly similar, and differences are often kind of measurement error, randomness, etc. So, sorry if that sounds very ignorant, please tell me.
No, yeah, thank you for this question. And it's true that the first thing I would like to recall, and then I have time to do so in the presentation, is that the theories that are tested in the studies that I mentioned are tested using the concept of revealed preferences. So the idea is to have an interpretation, a theory as to how people perceive immigration or the threats from immigration, and make some predictions based on this theory, and then test whether the evidence is actually in line with the predictions. Now, you're right that it's sort of over optimistic to think that individuals would, you know, be able, all at least, be able to perceive these threats and to actually react and based on these threats. And there might be margin of error, and sort of this could be random, or this could be just, you know, correlation that with something that we cannot observe. I would say that most of the time the hypothesis that is made is rather I would say realistic, in the sense that we expect people to have some sense of what immigration is like. So in this case, the skill composition, or the relative poverty or income level or education level of immigrants, and that would be the only hypothesis on which, you know, these studies would be based, and eventually find that the evidence is in line with the theory. So this is a very important point, also related to what I said about the imprecision of the measures that are usually used in these studies, and the fact that people are asked about whether they want more or less immigrants, generally speaking, and asked about their preferences towards immigration policy. But it is rarely the case that they are asked specifically about particular type of immigrants with the same skill level, or poor immigrants, or people, or immigrants who might end up, you know, eventually being welfare dependent, etc. So you're right that this is I wouldn't say a blind spot, but this is something that might seem a bit problematic, and I think most economists are very much aware of this. But again, we try to work around these issues with a theoretical framework that is as simplified as possible. And well, to the best of my knowledge, whatever evidence that I provide you with today is actually relatively, you know, I would say I'm relatively confident that you can trust them.
Thank you, Jerome. So a few questions for Karen. The first one is from Teresa Albano, who says, can you please share the ODI study? So I'm just going to go ahead and skip that and say, assume that you can, not least because it's online, I think. So I'll just get to the more substantive questions, which the first one is from Kikeli, who says, aren't there some ethical, moral issues in proposing policy recommendations that would be based on the quote, kind of immigrant people would want? They go on to state that the good refugee versus bad economic migrant is problematic. It doesn't challenge issues of racism and power relations, and that cannot be separated from attitudes and policies on migration. So Karen, I'm looking forward to a definitive and final answer to that.
I think it's a really good question and a very important point. I mean, I think that's something that I believe we speak to in the paper. If we don't, I think we should have. I think this binary we often see between the good refugee, the bad economic migrant, is really problematic, and I think is something that does need to really be challenged. I think I suppose my answer to that, I don't know if this is the definitive answer that James was looking for, but I think I would separate, I think there's a few elements to it. So I think there is a question, I think that a legitimate question in finding out what immigration preferences exist in a population. So which groups of immigrants a population are more or less open to. And I think, I suppose that my focus on that is less from the sort of point of view of saying, oh, great, people are really pro migrants from this country, let's open up immigration policy there. But I think really looking at that in terms of where there might be specific openings. So for example, in the UK at the moment, there's sort of generally less from a sort of specific immigration policy perspective, but a real sort of positivity towards healthcare workers in the context of the pandemic. So sort of looking at those kind of preferences, I think it's very interesting, and sort of saying, okay, looking at what we know about the attitudes that exist, are there policy openings to do more in this specific area? And I think there are some really interesting policy reforms that can be sort of, I guess, driven towards by asking those questions about what we see in a population at this moment in time. But I think there's also the secondary question, which I think you're sort of pointing to, is that I think that I don't think that should be the end point for our questions and for our sort of engagement with public attitudes, because I think then there's the secondary question of sort of, okay, if we're coming from a standpoint that we find the attitudes that we're seeing towards specific groups problematic, which I'd agree with you are problematic, I think then we're looking at how do we shift those attitudes towards specific groups, and what are the targeted actions that can be taken to, or targeted campaigns that can be planned to sort of look at shifting those attitudes. So I think I guess the point there is really that it's harder to do that if we're coming from a standpoint of not knowing the lay of the land. And I think in contexts like the UK, we have really good information and data on that. In other contexts, less so. So I think it's really, the point there is really about trying to understand those immigration policy preferences and then use that for looking for sort of openings for policy reform, but also looking at what that tells us about the kind of shifts of attitudes and action that we might want to undertake towards that.
Okay, another one for Karen, which is from Andrew, who's actually the director of the MPC. He asks, how do you change a frame? Is it about trying to give greater visibility to alternative frames? If so, how can that be done? And then he goes on to ask, what are the channels, for example, media, through which this could be achieved? And is there any evidence of which kind of channels have more effect? So there's kind of a few questions in there, but I think it all boils down ultimately to how does one change a frame?
Yeah, so again, another really good question. I mean, I think it is sort of looking at trying to give visibility to alternative ways of framing some of these questions. I think that's pretty much the point there. But I think it's sort of also looking at how do we do that. So I think I think there's a sort of challenge there for people who are sort of advocating for immigration reforms, trying to shift attitudes to sort of look at how they, and I'd include myself in that group, are framing some of these questions. And I guess looking at what is the starting point when we're sort of talking about immigration policy, immigration attitudes. Are we sort of coming at it straight from the framing that this is all about immigration, or are we starting from another starting point and sort of moving the conversation from there? So I think it's that question of how we're framing it, but I think also looking at that in terms of who is doing the framing and who are we talking to, and which conversations and where are we having those conversations. So if I'm sort of thinking of myself as someone working on immigration policy and sort of trying to sort of look at these framings, is it, if I'm just speaking to a group of people who are also working on immigration policy, potentially with a similar background, similar interests, similar group of opinions to myself, is that how we're going to shift sort of attitudes, policies, etc.? Or is it sort of someone who's working on those issues getting out into sort of different sets of conversations, potentially broader conversations, and bringing that perspective into broader questions and conversations about our societies and communities. And the second part of the question, I mean, I think generally I'd say that campaigns and around immigration and sort of tend to be very, I think that we don't see as much evaluation of campaigns as we should do in terms of their impact in shifting attitudes. So generally, I think, well, I mean, that's one of the, I didn't have time to speak to it, but it's one of the recommendations of our paper, sort of really trying to focus and invest in shifting, I guess sort of trying to make sure that we're really looking at funding how far campaigns are successful in shifting attitudes and getting better evidence on what works. I don't know whether Lenka or James, that might be something that you wanted to come in on as well. I know that's something that you would have done work on yourselves.
Do you know what, we're actually out of time, unfortunately, but I think that we could, I mean, it's such a shame because I think we could discuss with all three panelists all of these questions, and there are actually quite a few more questions in the YouTube chat, but we are out of time. So I'm just going to say thank you to everyone at home who's tuned in to watch this and who's watching on YouTube now afterwards. And also particularly, of course, thank you very much to Lenka, Jerome, and Karen for, I mean, really great presentations and great answers during the Q&A as well. There's so much stuff here. It's really just opening a bit of a can of worms, or Pandora's box. I don't know what the right metaphor would be. So I'll just say thank you very much to everyone, and see you soon.